I did hear that silent part, yeah.
Can you guys hear me now?
A
Just
little bit.
barely.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
But you know, this goes back to trying to confirm something you're doing, which is trying to help us understand why it's important to understand the degree of difficulty that Christ had in the sacrifice. And I think that's worth the effort to do that. So I think that's good.
Can you guys hear
Yeah,
me now?
Yeah.
yeah. And Dan,
Oh, great. Yes. Okay.
What'd you do? Turn your mic back on?
Yeah, I'm on. One thing I was thinking about, it's we've probably never, thankfully, ever seen anything as graphic as what happened to Christ in real life, but we probably had a experience where we saw like an animal that was completely mangled and ripped up and still alive. Like I think we've all had that experience. And I just saw like an animal last summer, and it really like triggered me. It was just this like little lizard, but like the lizard was alive, but it was like mangled, and it was just like the most pitiful thing. And my mind went to what Christ went through, and just just that the Son of God was completely mangled, like that animal was. And it's just another moving thing. Like uh, Ted, you and Lee talked about the Passion of the Christ, but yeah, we have to sit back and reflect on just what he did, so we never take it for granted.
That's right.
yeah. Two, you realize how serious God takes sin. That sin is a very serious thing, and that it always has to be punished. There, it's. I always think of, as a teacher, if you're a teacher, even if you're, being a parent, sometimes you overlook things. Like there were times walking down the hall at school, and I would hear kids say stuff, and I would go, if I stopped and addressed every time I heard a kid cuss, or every time a kid did something that was, I would never get, like, if I had to run to the restroom or get a drink of water, I would never get back. So I would just kind of like go down the hall and not try to like, and even in class, you sometimes overlook something that, but God doesn't, you realize God doesn't overlook anything. And there's nothing that gets by him. And not only that, everything has to be atoned for. Justice, if you've got perfect justice, if you're the actualization of justice, then there's nothing that gets by. There's no, I'm going to let that one slide. Go ahead. It's just everything. And that's the price of that is the beating, crucifixion of Jesus. So he now talks about the cross. And I've heard different things about exactly how Jesus was crucified, and I don't get too bogged down in details. But he talked about how typically the spikes for the cross were 5 to 7 inches long and were tapered to a sharp point. I, as a little kid, always thought the nails were driven here, but as you guys know, the nails about an inch below the palm, and it's the largest nerve that goes from the arm into the hand. And just that, it's not just that you're getting your nail into your hand, it's right there on that nerve. And the doctor that Strobel interviewed said, if you've ever hit your funny bone, there's a nerve, it's called the ulnar nerve, right here. And when you hit that, if you hit it just right, it makes the whole arm tingle, but it can really be painful. Before you get all that tingly, the funny feeling, it can be really, really painful. And so imagine taking pliers and just crushing that. It's the same thing when Jesus was nailed to the cross. Both hands, both wrists. I did not realize this. Maybe if I did, it had been a while since I've heard it, but the term excruciating literally means out of the cross. So when you look at the spelling of excruciating, it has the R-U-C, and crucifixion has that R-U-C. So it literally comes from the cross, that term for pain that's just unimaginably bad. That's where the term excruciating comes from. And it literally comes from the crucifixion. So there was probably, once he was nailed to the crossbeam, then according to this particular doctor, there probably was a stake that was already in the ground, a vertical stake, and they hoisted him up and attached the crossbeam to the vertical stake. And then, of course, you've got nails that were driven into the feet. And then you've got the whole other situation with nerves in the feet. Both shoulders would have been, and he got into the whole physics of it. So this guy's a physics guy too. But he said both shoulders would have definitely been dislocated, which goes with Psalm 22, the prophecy of his bones being out of joint. Remember, David writes in Psalms 22 about his bones being out of joint would go with him being placed on the nail to the cross. So at this point, once he's on the cross, as we all know, it's just a matter of asphyxiation. So you're locked into, when Christ was placed on the cross, he was basically locked into the inhaled position. So it's like you take a deep breath of air, but you can't get it out in that position. So in order to exhale and to continue the breathing cycle, the person being crucified must take and push up with their feet. Well, their feet are nailed to the vertical beam, which is going to tear your foot when you go to try to breathe out. And so, of course, you've got Jesus's back, which has been ripped to shreds with the flogging. So that's rubbing up against the cross, which is probably jagged wood. And so basically you're just going through that cycle of trying to exhale and inhale air until exhaustion overtakes the person. So as Christ's breathing would have eventually started to slow down as he becomes exhausted, there's a condition known as respiratory acidosis. So basically, that carbon dioxide is acidic. So you begin to get a high concentration of CO2 in your blood. And this over time is going to, along with, remember, he's experiencing the hypovolemic shock, which is the tremendous loss of blood. So he's running on loss of blood, he's in shock, and then eventually the respiratory acidosis is those two are going to work together to cause heart failure. So his heart will eventually stop beating and he'll die. He also described the medical terminology for, remember, I believe it's in John, it's John 19, where the soldier, to make sure Jesus is dead, he stabs him and all the fluid and blood come out. And so that's from what he called pericardial effusion. That's where, as Jesus is struggling, fluid builds up in the membrane around the heart, but it also happens around the lungs, and that's called pleural effusion. So you get effusions where fluid builds up in those membranes, and then some blood would have spilled out, and that's described by John in John chapter 19, verse 34. which fits the science, which is what would have happened scientifically there had that happened. You guys have got a couple of other things here to talk about, but that's a good place to take any questions or comments you guys might have.
I was just going to mention, Lee, that it's interesting that, you get a lot of these, these ones who are leftists, who come up with a lot of these theories, and they're doing it here about almost 2,000 years removed. A lot of this stuff is coming out of the 18th, 19th century scholars. And, in some respects, they're trying to argue from the standpoint, hey, we're so far removed from this, here's one possibility, or here's something that could have happened. But the other side of this is, I think whenever we're having these discussions with people, especially who are reading some of this scholarship, and they're saying, oh, this person, we have to remind people too that, yeah, we're far removed from this time period, but those who lived in that time were not far removed. And I kind of wonder, imagine trying to bring this argument up to someone who's actually living in that time, who actually witnesses crucifixions on a daily basis, and telling them, hey, Jesus probably survived that crucifixion over there.
Yeah.
What would they say? They would be like, oh, come on. Yeah, right. No one would have believed that in that time, because they actually, these things, they saw these things. It would have been unbelievable to them. And that's why I don't think we have any stories that, nobody writes. No, to my knowledge, I don't do a lot of history reading of that time period other than the Bible. But, to my knowledge, there's no source, there's no writers in that era who said, oh yeah, people were walking away from crucifixions all the time. Maybe Jesus did too. But you get this story about 1900 years later, and then all of a sudden it becomes believable. Well, maybe believable because we don't see them today, but I doubt in my mind that anyone who witnessed crucifixions in those days would have believed that. And that's why you don't have this theory in those times. Yeah.
That's a good point, Daniel. It kind of goes along with what this scholar said, and that he said Romans, if they knew how to do anything really well, it was to kill people. He said they knew what they were doing, and exactly. I mean, that it always comes back to is, and I know this is, somebody would accuse me of circular reasoning because I'm using the Bible, but it's still, it goes with what you said too. When Paul was before Agrippa, I just love that exchange. When was it Felix that said, Paul, your learning is driving you mad. You're crazy. And then Paul said very calmly, no, I'm not crazy, most excellent Festus. He then goes to Agrippa. He said, kind sir, I'm paraphrasing, but you know these things. They weren't done in a corner. And you believe the prophets, don't you? And notice Agrippa doesn't. He just says, you think you're going to convince me to be a Christian in a short time? He respected the prophets, and he knew all this stuff happened out in the open. It's not some kind of secret cult, or it happened out in the open, and it was a pride thing for him. Just like Herod, and just like Felix and Festus and all those guys, they knew the truth. It was just pride, getting off their high pony and saying, I'm going to bow down to the feet of Christ and I'm going to become a Christian. There's no way that he's, what? So, there was, back in I wasn't aware of this, but back in 1968, Strobel kind of has this, says that there was an article written in the Harvard Theological Review and they said that there's astonishing little evidence that the feet of crucified people were ever pierced by nails. And this was back in 1968. Later on, and this we see this happening all the time with the Bible, how archaeology verifies something in the Bible. But these guys basically were shut down when they discovered there were 36 Jews' corpses that they discovered, and that one they found that there was a 7, basically silenced the argument. They did use rope. It's not that they didn't use rope, but they also used nails as well. And the very last thing I have, and then I've got a little bit of time left if you guys want to chime in with something. Strobel just wouldn't stop. He said, just say what if. Just what if somehow Jesus survived the flogging, the crucifixion, he somehow got out of all the burial clothes, the wrappings, moved the stone away and got away from the Romans and found his brothers. Just what if? And so the last thing the guy says, the good doctor says to that, and I'm just gonna read it because he puts it really well. He said, after suffering that horrible abuse with all the catastrophic blood loss and trauma, he would have looked so pitiful that the disciples would never have held him as a victorious conqueror of death. They would have felt sorry for him and tried to nurse him back to health. So it is preposterous to think that if he had appeared to them in that awful state, his followers would have been prompted to start a worldwide movement based on the hope that someday they too would have a resurrection body like his. There is just no way. And it's kind of how they wrap up the interview. And I thought that was very appropriate.
Amen.
Lee, there's still
Yes.
people today that want to say that there's multiple paths to God besides Jesus. And if that were true, if there is another way to God besides Jesus, then the whole crucifixion was completely unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the only way that Jesus would have gone through that, the only reason that he did go through it, because he didn't want to go through it, is that he knew that there was no other way for us to be forgiven.
Yeah, David, that's you're kind of coming through a little bit choppy, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. And I think that's a really good point. David was saying how, if there are multiple paths to God, why in the world would God come down and be brutalized like that by his own creation and be ridiculed? And yeah, that's a very powerful point.
I was just thinking about this too, how, let's just say, he escapes the crucifixion and everything, and he goes off somewhere. If someone's going to have that, deception and try to trick everybody, when he goes off and he's away from everyone, there's no glory for him, because everyone thought, he's gone and he's risen, but he's not receiving. He wouldn't receive any glory. Everyone thinks he's gone. So it's why would he do it? To me, it doesn't make sense just from a man's perspective. Just if you're looking for glory or anything like that, you're gone and you're away from everyone, never to be seen again.
Yeah. Good point. Well, thank you guys very much. I almost said I enjoyed the study. This one was kind of tough for me. It always is, but I think it's good to always remind ourselves of the cross and the seriousness of sin and the perfect justice of our God.
Amen. Thank you, Lee.
Yeah, thanks for teaching. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank y'all for being here tonight.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay. See you, Frank.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.